My name is Mignon Nixon, and I have the pleasure of chairing the next session, which is on psychoanalytic anxieties. And the first speaker will be well known to some of you. She is Dr. Rachel Warrener, and she is the British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where she is researching feminist activist groups in the New York art world of the 1970s. She has a book about to come out, which is called Pain and Politics in Post-War Feminist Art, subtitled Activism in the Work of Nancy Spero. And she's obviously going to be speaking about Nancy Spero this afternoon, because you're seeing a work by Nancy Spero there. And the title of her talk this afternoon is Maternal Apocalypse.
Lovely, thank you. I have to say my apocalypse is a much less grand one than the ones we've been speaking about so far, and also much more personally traumatic, as I hope will become clear. But I'd like to start by thanking Eddie and all the other speakers so far for what's already been a fascinating day. And I'd also like to thank Mignon for the introduction, particularly because what I want to discuss in this paper comes as a response to her 2007 article, Spero's Curses. It is from her essay that I take my title and my interest in thinking through Nancy Spero's works made in the early 1960s as an imaging and imagining of maternal subjectivity. Following Spero's accounts of her experience of maternal ambivalence and aggression, Mignon focuses on one of these works, the gouache on paper Les Anges Merde Fuck You, made in 1960, describing it as an example of a maternal apocalypse, influenced by Spero's interest in historical sources, particularly the Beatus apocalypse that acted as inspiration for her. Mignon proposes Les Anges Merde Fuck You as an example of a work that, in her words, throws light into the dark corners of maternal subjectivity, placing it within the trajectory of Spero's broader career by identifying in it some key characteristics of her work as it develops, notably the hysterical sensibility that runs throughout the 60s and 70s, and ties these early expressions of ambivalent anger to her later pointed critiques of the structural, social and physical violence inflicted on women by a misogynistic society. Her reading is, as anyone familiar with her work might expect, convincing, capturing how these early images that she describes in Adrienne Rich's terms as representing the waves of love and hate that come alongside motherhoods are the beginnings of Spero's aesthetic explorations of women's treatment under patriarchy. For the purposes of my paper, however, I want to dwell on Spero's turn to the visual language of the apocalypse at the moment of her experience of the early infancy of her sons, as invited by Mignon's essay, offering a reading that doesn't challenge so much as sit alongside hers. Drawing on the work of Lisa Baraitser, I want to shift the emphasis to think about how these images can be seen as artifacts of the work of care, considering how Spero represents maternity and the seismic impact that having children has on the subject. With the apocalypse as a useful formal and conceptual metaphor here in its implications not only of destruction, but also renewal through violent means, I want to focus on these paintings as unusual in their art historical representation of maternity, where the artwork is not a direct picturing of the work of care, but a contemplation on the profound effect that having children it has on the artist mother. Of course, as may or may not, maybe of course, maybe not, the more observant among you may have noticed that I've got some skin in the game at the moment, and therefore perhaps I run the risk of some form of prenatal projection in that I am around something like 6 months pregnant. Although for me anyway, it's important to note that the abstract for this paper came before my current pregnancy, still unquestionably my thinking on this series of paintings is inherently tied to my own experience of maternity. My first proper consideration of them came as I blearily emerged from the maternity leave with my son, now 6, and in those probably too early moments after having had him, the painting's composition and formal choices, as much as the loved but monstrous figures, seemed to capture something of the psychic experience of early parenthood. The loose interpretation of apocalyptic imagery seemed to me then, as now, as a clever analogy for the profound change that children bring, the shifts in perspective, relationships, understanding of the world, the future and its significance, and interruption into the long-established sense of self that I had experienced over the then 6 months of his life. So to think about these paintings, I'm also going to draw on my own experience of the psychic annihilation of early motherhood, to examine those rhymes and resonances visible in this appropriation of apocalyptic imagery. In this, I hope not to project too much onto the work of an artist with an established practice and figurative approach. Of course, her psychic experience is not what is figured here, at least not straightforwardly. In order to avoid this, I want to turn to Lisa Baretz's writing on the role of objects in the work of care, thinking about how her description of reciprocal objects might be useful in formulating an idea of how these works can be considered as part of a reflection on maternal experience. In her 2009 book, Maternal Encounters, Baretz offers a complex model of how mothers are shaped by their relationships to their children, focusing on the mundane experiences of caring, the constant interruptions, waiting for a child to finish a sentence, taking them out of the house, and so on. In her final chapter, Baretz introduces the concept of viscosity to describe how being encumbered by the stuff of motherhood changes the ways in which the mother moves and works, stating this new kinetic experience creates and informs the texture of her lived experience. Taking up Elaine Scarry's consideration of reciprocal objects, she thinks about how a well-designed buggy or a favourite toy becomes an ally in the work of care, how the mother, particularly one in the capitalist West, newly encumbered by a world of changing mats, slings, monitors, swaddling cloths, and the endless other tools, trinkets and essential items of modern parenting, is shaped by her relationship to them. To my mind, this change in the experience of the world of objects might also affect the ways in which the artist mother, a maker of things, might create objects to similarly relate to the physical as well as psychic experience of motherhood, and that particularly those images that relate to motherhood itself, even if abstracted, might be shaped by that experience. That formal and material choices, as well as chosen modes of representation, might reflect the remade relationship to the object world, one tied to a change in an experience of subjectivity where the boundaries between specific individuals are blurred and confused. Similarly, I wonder if the paintings can themselves act as reciprocal objects in this sense, offering a way of approaching motherhood that facilitates the full feeling of the complex emotional terrain of caring for young children, reaching out to the viewer across social conventions that restrict and restrain the mother to offer her a way of thinking through the sublime violence that is being committed against her subjectivity in the early moments of caring. In this way, I want to both read these paintings as artefacts of Spiro's care for her children and also offer a sense of how they worked for me as reciprocal objects. In my metaphoric use, which sees the apocalypse as a moment in which a sudden, forceful, almost sublime change overwhelms the subject, I see these images as potential allies in negotiating the path through to what fidelity to my metaphor requires me to describe as salvation, imagined here as the rather pathetic outcome of settling into parenting. My tentative proposal is that these works have acted as allies by first expressing for the artist mother and then visualizing for the viewer mother how aggression, frustration and parental love coexist, manifesting the profound weirdness of caring for an infant, especially for those mothers who were pregnant with their children, having to negotiate the newly found borders between individuals who once inhabited the same body, whilst also being hepped up on hormones, and offering a way to untangle the complexities of loving a child when it comes into conflict with your individual wants, needs and desires. Although Spiro's interest in the major themes of the series I am focusing on was well established before the artist was a mother and was living with her family, the painter Liane Golub and their 3 young sons in Paris, there is a material change in her practice that comes with the arrival of her children. It was during this period that the artist created her first major set of gouache works on paper, a mode of making that would stay with her throughout the 60s. The majority of works until this point had been oil-on-canvas paintings, made slowly over long periods through a laborious process of building bright layers of paint to such an extent that they became dark, brooding and muddy overworked surfaces. Where the paintings are the result of many months, sometimes years of work, the gouaches are quick, scratched onto smaller pieces of paper, ideally suited not only to time snatched from maternal duties, but to the quick expression of the emotional realities of caring for children. Spiro herself ties the imagery of these gouaches to her experience as a mother, albeit at a remove which focused on the mythological implications of the mother rather than a direct rendering. However, their anger is described as stemming directly from her experience as an artist mother, whose life and career were dominated by the work of care, affecting her visibility and recognition, and leading to her gendered sidelining by an art world that celebrates masculine creativity. In some ways, though, I think the focus on the representation of anger in these works obscures the way in which love is figured. Les Anges Meurent, Fuck You, for example, is often discussed for the aggressive expulsions that sit on the page, but less attention is given to its depiction of maternal affection. Labelled as Les Anges in Spiro's scrawled cursive, the three figures that float across the surface of the page can be read as representations of children, comparable to other figures explicitly titled as such in other paintings made around this time. The choice of the term Les Anges is interesting. It is an unquestionably affectionate declaration, but also a deeply conventional one, coming from a given set of terms of endearment unspecific to the particular children being described, asserting their innocence and purity, related above all to their infancy. To call this expression of affection conventional is not to diminish it. Instead, it can be seen to reflect the specific demands of loving children. Not only are our feelings about our children, particularly our very young children, often filtered along well-trodden linguistic paths, but children who have a grasp on language, I think, welcome conventional modes of expression, not yet familiar enough with the social world to find cliché uncomfortable, instead calling a child angel, or for that matter, sweetheart or darling, mirrors that which they see around them, affirming your feelings for them as the uncomplicated, conventional feelings that confirm parental love in the social and cultural expression that children are exposed to. Indeed, in my own experience of talking to my very articulate and conversationally demanding child, I am always aware of how straightforward my declarations of love for him are, and how inappropriate it would be for me to express to him the ambivalence of the experience of maternal love. The knowledge that you are talking to someone who needs you to love them as part of their development, and that they are always in the process of being formed, means that you rely on the most hackneyed forms of expression, suspending disbelief at their simplicity and cliché, and instead trying at least to manifest their lack of complexity as true expression, which it both is and is not, as anyone with any knowledge of psychoanalysis will of course already know. Therefore, the term Les Anges manifests love, but of a very particular kind. It demonstrates the demand on mothers to love their children in specific ways, meaning that it is not genuinely felt. My own cliched expressions of love for my child are of my most unembarrassed and truthful splurges of emotion, but that expression of love takes into account the ways in which our words to our children are measured for their potential impact on the imagined future subjects our children will become. The visual separation of the two kinds of sentiments, the profane and aggressive Meurent and Fuck You, from the affectionate Les Anges seems to support this. Even in this rendering of ambivalence and frustration, the bodies of the figures are bracketed off as those of angels, kept separate from the sprawling blackness of aggression and anger which they fly through. Similarly, the 1960 gouache Mother and Child offers an image which manifests the aggression experienced by the nursing mother in her children's need for her body, but that figures the mother as not returning that aggression, but instead as neutral, almost benign. It shows a female figure standing face on to the viewer, with two figures in profile biting hungrily at her naked breasts. The face of the mother in this image is more carefully and gently rendered than the two chomping figures of the children. Unlike her other images of mothers and children, for example this, Her Mother and Children from 1962, which features an androgynous-looking figure standing totemic above her two equally small children who stand beneath her, here the mother seems gentle in the depiction of the lower half of her face and her positioning. Her body is open to the two children, presented not perhaps entirely willingly, but with forbearance. Angry scratched lines are scribbled over her body, obscuring the children and implying a desperation in their need for sustenance, but they barely affect her face, leaving the frenzied mark as a representation of infantile, not maternal aggression. As with much of Spiro's imagery, only the parts of the body that are relevant to the ideas of the work that the work seeks to convey are shown. The figures are unfinished, traced on the page without the lower halves of their bodies. Mouths and breasts are the focus of this exchange. The contrast between the chomping mouths of the children and the passive expression of the mother's lips is marked. It is by no means a Madonna and child image that suggests that this experience of being chewed on and used for comfort need be met with a gentle gaze of a doting mother, but it neither suggests maternal violence towards the two demanding children. The mother is pictured here as passively bearing the weight of this need. Rather than a picturing of maternal aggression, this painting potentially works to recognise the feeling of impossible violence being inflicted upon the tolerating subject. This is an image made from a mother's point of view. Those scratched lines that cover her body are indexical of their making, inviting the viewer to imagine the artist dragging her brush across the surface of the paper in a frenzied movement that suggests an expression of anger and frustration at the child's voracious needs. The artist mother's formal approach contradicts the calmness of the represented mother, imaging the experience of wanting to be a gentle, calm, forbearing presence whilst overwhelmed and exasperated. A final thought for my apocalyptic metaphor. These are images made at night. Spira, like many other parents, had to carve out time for her work in the uninterrupted moments of night where her children slept, allowed respite of concentration during their rest. Her dark images and ghost-like representations mirror this, reflecting that strange and under-discussed parental labour of sitting in a quiet house at night, diligently watching over precious children as they rest, heightening both the sense of their vulnerability in their need for care and the ways in which parents are trapped by these needs. It is also a time when you are allowed, hopefully, some time away from them to reflect, to dwell on those feelings that are unwelcome in their presence. Mirroring that time of contemplation in their formal choices, Spira's maternal apocalypses hold in tension the competing experiences of love and aggression, allowing both to be considered in a way only in the gaps between the onslaught, working as reciprocal objects to offer the viewer mother and the artist mother a chance to understand her position and to steel herself against the next reckoning. Thank you.